live. Fred, thank you very much for coming on and being so willing to share your career story. How are you? Live and exclusive from Houston, Texas this morning.
Doing well. Glad to be here.
Brilliant, brilliant. So look, we had a good catch up, informal catch up during the week, and I really enjoyed that chat. And you have a very illustrious and interesting career path. But before we get into it, maybe you could just introduce yourself to everybody and maybe talk a little bit about what you're doing today.
Well, currently I'm working on in two areas. One in the business arena, looking at the impact that the environment, the work environment that management creates, the impact that has on safe and productive operations for employees. And then also I do writing, and I'm a publisher. I work with small or new authors on releasing books, and particular focus on somebody that has a voice that is useful to be shared with the world.
Brilliant. And how did the writing aspect come about?
Behind almost every question that you're going to ask me is a long, in-depth, convoluted, but very interesting story.
We have time.
The short version of that is my wife was involved in the entertainment industry. She's a trained actress and has been in movies and TV and commercials and things. And so at the time I met her, I was a new writer. I was beginning writing. I was interested in script writing. And we were at a conference in Los Angeles, and she ran into this guy that was a former gang member of a really violent gang in East Los Angeles County. She introduced me to him, and we connected. He wanted to tell his story. He'd just gotten out of prison for killing a former rival gang member, and he wanted to write his story, and we connected. And over the next few years, we refined the manuscript and published it. And that's how I got into the formal writing process. And then the place that we published it, we didn't care for how they were managing it, and so I learned the process of publishing myself and made the connections, and we released his book under my label, and then I've been writing under that label ever since, and added other authors too.
Fascinating. There's probably a whole podcast just on that whole experience, but maybe if you could just, what was it like to be involved in meeting somebody like that and spending time with them? And
it was a whole different environment, which kind of my whole life has been investigating different environments, being thrown into a situation that I didn't know anything about, but just dove in and figured it out as I went. But I remember sitting on a sidewalk in Los Angeles in the gang area with former gang members. We're sitting in chairs out front of this little venue, and I'm thinking, what am I doing here? Because I'm the only white guy amongst a group of Latinos, amongst a group of former gang members, and in their environment. And how did I get here? That afternoon before coming over there, I was sitting on another sidewalk in just outside of Sony Studios in an upscale restaurant, having lunch with a creative director from the studio, one of the studios over there. And so my life has been contrast like that, but really kind of interesting connections, a whole series of interesting connections from just being willing to meet people and learn about how they view the world.
Fascinating. And what was the name of that book, Fred, so that I can read it and do another podcast with you afterwards?
That's Homeboy Soul.
Homeboy Soul.
Yeah, and the co-author, the main individual that the book is about is Don Armijo. It's available on Amazon. It's available on Amazon.
Is it? Brilliant. I'm definitely going to get a copy of that, and I'm going to get you to commit to coming back on, and we'll delve into that aspect of your life.
And what's truly intriguing about that is we made an agreement on the front end of working together that he was going to tell his story honestly, that his story, whether it reflected good on him or bad on him, he was going to tell it the way it happened and not try to embellish and make himself look good.
Yeah. But I assume it was a story of maybe reform post-prison, was it?
The main theme that came out of that book was that the decisions you make guide your life. And if you want your life to go in a different direction, make different decisions.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Well, I'm going to get that. And so, and you mentioned script writing in the early days. How far down the path did you get in script writing?
We got up to the point of being the second script in consideration for production, and ours was not selected, unfortunately. We're down to 2 scripts with a large Hollywood production company, well-known actor behind it, and it was our script and another script, and unfortunately the flip of the coin went with the other one. I think the production costs were lower on the other script is my
right
view of that. We'd won several national, international contests. We gotten a lot of acclaim for the quality of the writing. We had ins in several production companies out there. We were serious contenders.
So really close, really close.
Really close.
Yeah, but brilliant experience though, right? To see that side of things.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and so take me back then, and we'll build back up to what you're doing today and how you arrived there. But tell us a little bit about what your thought process was as a late teen, as you were embarking on thinking about what you were going to do for a living.
As a teen, I probably didn't think about that. When I was very, very young, preteen, grade school age, my concept was that I was going to be a horse rancher in Wyoming. I loved horses. They were just phenomenal animals. That didn't, of course, play out. And I really didn't have any concept after abandoning that. It's just kind of, I went to school, went to college, just as almost an exercise, because everybody else that I was associated with, that's what they were doing. It wasn't until really I got out of college and about 2 or 3 years later, I hit on this kind of concept that never let work get in the way of having fun. And so I've always approached each job with that. I worked during college at as a cashier and cook at a drive-in theater, and that was horrendously fun. I mean, it was almost that we didn't go there to work. There was a group of us that went there to hang out with each other each evening. But the first serious job really after college was driving a truck cross country. I drove a truck cross country for 4 years, and that I think my goal at that time was to see the world, to learn about the world. I felt kind of confined in the space where I'd gone to school and had grown up, and I was starting to meet people around the country and around the world, and had pen pals, and I just wanted to get out and see the world. And that I figured that somebody's going to pay me to drive around the country and look at things, and then just have a trailer behind me where I deliver things on the way. That sounds pretty cool.
Yeah, there's something very romantic about that idea, isn't there, of driving across, especially the US, with the vastness of it in a truck. And it sounds even more romantic to me, you know, in the evening when the 3 kids are tired and screaming. I think it's a brilliant, brilliant profession. But what did you enjoy most about that, and what was the biggest challenges even in doing a job like that?
What I enjoyed most was seeing places, getting the scenery, meeting cool people, just things that you see on TV or read about in books. You got to go out and see them and look at them and touch them and see what those places were like. There was a balance between the way that I tend to describe it, truck driving is it's hours and hours of sheer boredom interspersed with moments of terror.
Really?
The boredom was getting from one place to another, sitting behind the wheel for 8 or 10 hours a day and moving this vehicle across the highways and such. Interspersed between that, you may have a flat tire, you may run into something, somebody may pull out in front of you. There's a whole variety of things that can happen when you're on the road that are negative. But then the positive element of that is you're always meeting new people, you're learning about new cultures. There's a lot of, within the US is a kind of a compendium of different cultures. And so getting out and actually meeting those people, figuring out how to interface with them, a way that I initially, if I couldn't think of something else about something, the question I'd typically ask them is, what's the most bizarre thing that's ever happened to you? And that would almost always start a conversation. There was a lady at a fruit stand down in Florida. I asked that, and she said, "Oh yes, this woman came in one time and she was squeezing the tomatoes, and I told her to stop squeezing the tomatoes, and she wouldn't stop. She just kept squeezing the tomatoes." And she stopped there, and I thought, this is the most bizarre thing that's ever happened to you. Wow. And then on the other end of the spectrum, I was talking to somebody at a swimming pool at a motel where I was staying one time. Usually I slept in the truck, but sometimes I'd splurge and get a motel room. And she said she was on a horseback riding trip in Costa Rica with her boyfriend. They were up in the mountains, up in the forest, and way out away from any civilization. And this wild stallion came up and had a thing for her horse, which was a mare, and decided that they were going to mate while she was riding on it. And so he's kind of bucking up and trying to hump the mare, knocks her off. She breaks her leg. She has to be backpacked down to a place where a helicopter can come in, airlift her back to civilization, and then she's flown back to the US to a hospital. I thought, now that balances against the tomato story.
It does. You get each end of the spectrum. Fantastic. And so you mentioned before you took the truck driving job, you were in college. Can you talk a little bit about what you studied in college and how then you got that first job when you got out?
I studied mathematics, degrees in computer science, mathematics with a minor in French, foreign languages.
Yeah. And what was the driver for Ed for picking that in the first place?
I think it was a friend of mine that I'd gone through high school with. He was interested in computer science, and he said, you need to check this out. And I hadn't really thought of that before. I was really focused more on history, and I'm glad that he redirected me in the computer science direction, because that was very contemporary at the time. This was in the 70s, early 70s.
Very good. And then you did that, and then you came out and you were just looking for, was the truck driving job a sort of the idea of just doing something that would take you around the country a little bit, have fun before doing something else, or how did you decide to get into that part?
The direction that I was going coming out of college was teacher, to become a math teacher. And I did that on a substitute basis for a couple of years. At the same time, in the evenings, I was the gentleman I mentioned that was got me focused on computer science was also in a band. They needed a sound individual to operate the sound and lights, and invited me to do that. So I started working with them through the band. One of their fans was a local truck driver, and he and I became friends. I began riding with him on his trips just around locally around Kansas, around the state. And I hadn't realized at the time that he was interested in retiring and getting out of the business and wanted to sell the truck. And the more I learned about it, the more interested I got in buying the truck from him. So we made that connection, and that's really it kind of happened without a plan.
Yeah.
There's just so many things that I've done. I fall into an opportunity. To me, there's windows of opportunity all around us. They open and close periodically, and it's having an awareness that they're there, and which ones you're interested in allow you to pursue a lot of interesting options in your life.
Yeah. Yeah, and we had that chat, didn't we, earlier this week, where it's about being open to things, and looking for them, and following your gut a little bit, because I guess a lot of people, and I put myself in this category a little bit, I think, is, after doing your kind of college education, the expectation then is you move forward into, a job aligned to that career and start your career path. Whereas, you did something a little bit different. And was there an expectation then, Fred, all that time studying? Was there any of that going on, or?
Oh, you cut out for just a moment there. What was that again?
Yeah, I was just saying, was there an expectation, having come out of college and spending the time studying mathematics and computer science, that you go into something more aligned to it? And did you feel that pressure from anybody in terms of having to do that?
No, I've always had the luxury of pretty much pursuing the interest that I've had and figuring out how I'm going to pay my way through life. But it's more, I've viewed more a path of discovery, kind of in terms of the career, and doing things that interested me, and then migrating those things that were of interest into a professional arena. As an example, when I was teaching after truck driving, then I went into teaching formally and did that for about 10 years. I was interested in the space program. That was kind of my hobby outside of teaching. So anything space, I would read it, I'd follow up on it, and I was probably, as far as anybody in the city, one of the most enthusiastic space supporters of that there was. But when the Challenger blew up, before that, I applied for the Teacher in Space program. I didn't get anywhere with that, but it was one of those windows that opened, but I didn't get through the window. But when the Challenger then blew up, I started thinking, what's going to happen a year from now? That was, I think, in the late 80s when that happened. And I thought, probably just a memorial service. But the intention of the Teacher in Space project was to elevate the awareness of school kids, high school and young kids, K through 12, in the aerospace arena, and really become aerospace literate. And so I thought, well, why not continue that effort to the same degree that we can without having the shuttle in orbit and without having the Teacher in Space broadcasting from up there? But all the teachers on the ground can still cover that topic, can still pursue that effort. That doesn't mean that that effort had to quit. And so through just that idea, I started pulling together materials and got support of the Kansas National Education Association, the teachers union. Ended up within a year probably impacting around a million students throughout the US, and directly contacting more than 2,000, probably 2,500 teachers around the US. That produced some awards and recognition from NASA, from the National Science Teachers Association, from the National Education Association. That got me noticed at NASA, which then led to the next step a couple of years later of actually getting a job working in the space program.
Amazing, amazing. And it just and back to what you said, you know, it's about if you have a passion for something to keep the curiosity going, keep focusing on it, and think and doors can open. But just before
Yeah.
we get back into that, I mean, a couple of things. I just want to understand just that transition from when you were driving the truck to doing this piece, right? And that's just on the timeline. But you said you applied for the Challenger uh, program, which is, you know, that's quite amazing that you went through that you had applied and then what happened subsequently. How did you feel at that moment in time?
That was it was an educational process for me. The application was about a 15-page essay answers process. I'd done a little bit of writing before, but nothing formal, and I wasn't all that good at it at that time. But one of the teachers at the school where I worked was a good writer. She sat down with me when I was filling that process, when I was doing that application process, and everything I wrote, she would review it and tell me what was good and bad and what needed to be revised. In that effort, with her assistance, I was able to start looking at what I wrote and see red or green. The green was good. The red needed to be either taken out or changed. Before that, it was just blur. I wrote something, it was either good or bad. I couldn't rewrite it. I didn't know what to rewrite. With her help, I learned how to edit writing, and it's been my concept ever since that the quality of writing is in the editing process. It's not in the initial data dump. But I would write something, and 10 or 15 edits later, it would be good. Not just one or two, 10 or 15, because if it's something that's of any length, it's hard to focus on all the elements you need to focus on in the editing process all at once. Transitions, verbs, action, all of those things. And so each pass through it, each editing pass through it, you improve the quality of one of those elements, then go through and focus on another element, go through, edit. And the more you edit, the better it gets. The point where you're not really changing anything, you're finished.
Yeah. Yeah, very interesting, very interesting. And just, I guess, just to clarify for anyone that mightn't have been aware of when we're talking about the Challenger, and you can correct me, but that was the space shuttle in the 70s that was bringing, I can't remember how many civilians were supposed to go on it, but one teacher was to go for the reasons you said, and it subsequently exploded.
That was in the late 80s, yeah.
And was it the late 80s? Yeah.
There were five astronauts on it, one teacher.
One teacher, yeah. Yeah, and so after that, so you got into the space program. Talk a little bit about what you did there.
Oh, and on your previous question in regard to the Challenger application, or the teacher in space application, I learned from that process also. First, I learned to write with the other teachers' help, and then in the application, I didn't get anywhere in the application, but I was allowed to go down to the State Board of Education and look at the winning applications. And the winning applications, there was a stark difference between what I had and what they had. I had just a bit of work experience. They had a lot of focused work experience, plus they had a lot of membership in organizations and outside activities in relevance to their work activities. So they had like a whole plethora of memberships and officer assignments in the organizations and professional organizations and associations that I'm totally missing on mine. I spent the next 2 years filling that gap, making sure that I participated and joined organizations and was active at the higher level in the organization. So I got those things. So from that point forward, I was always looking at my resume compared to somebody that's made accomplishments and seeing what was missing on mine and filling in those gaps to the degree I could, so that I didn't want to not be competitive in anything else I applied for.
That's very interesting. That was a good learning, wasn't it? And it just shows to people, if whatever it is you're doing, to get involved in that community, in order to I suppose, gather as much information as you can, but even industry bodies, whatever industry you're in, just to be involved, it does help.
Well, be involved and be a contributor. So it's not just you're in it for the job because they pay you, but you're in it because you enjoy what that community is doing and you want to participate and help that community be successful.
Yeah.
And then moving into the space program, actually, that was an interesting situation. Another one of those windows of opportunity. Because of the awards, I'd been down to NASA. I met people at NASA and had contacts down there, and they kept saying, "Why don't you move down here? This is where you really want to work." And so it took 2 years, but I eventually loaded up the car and moved down there. And one of the guys that worked in the program let me stay at his place. And I immediately signed up for a temp job. I got, luckily, intriguingly, amazingly, assigned as the secretary, temporary secretary. She was out sick, for the individual that headed up the entire contractor operation of the shuttle program. This guy was in charge of making the entire shuttle program operate, and the government had hired this contractor to do that. I was his secretary. I was in charge of getting my assignment renewed every Friday. A lot of the people got their 40 hours, 50, 60 hours in by noon on Friday, and so they disappear in the afternoon. And I needed 5 signatures every Friday, otherwise I wasn't going to come back on Monday. So that was my focus on Friday, was to get 5 signatures on a piece of paper. And I started as soon as I walked in the door.
No pressure.
No. No. And one day, one of the managers stopped me in the hallway, and she said, "We think we've got a job for you." I don't know if she'd seen the resume or heard that I was a teacher or what the deal was. I didn't know how much she knew about me. But she said, "We think we've got a job that you'd like to do." I said, "Well, what is it?" She said, "We need somebody to develop a technical training program for the aerospace engineers." There were 90 of them that for the Ascent group that developed the shuttle flight. They program the computers, they figure out what the computers have to do, all the mechanics and the physics of putting the shuttle in orbit. I said, "Okay." She said, "Do you know how to do that?" I thought, she wants to hear yes. I said, "Yes." But I made sure there was no hesitation between when she asked that question and when I answered. I didn't want her to kind of evaluate, well, does he really know? And then she said, "Okay." They ended up hiring me. They had to do some finagling to make sure that the hiring worked, because they had other applicants. They rewrote the job request, and so that they were going to hire me. Got the job. She said, "Now I want you to go talk to one of our program managers, and she's going to give you all the details of what we want." I thought, okay. So I did not want to run out of ink in talking to her. I wanted to make sure, and I captured everything that she said. So I had 5 pens and a stack of paper, and I was ready to write notes like crazy. We sit down at a table in a conference room. She says, "Now, we want a technical training program." Wrote that down. I said, "Yes." And she says, "You know how to do that, right?" I thought she wants to hear yes too. So I said, "Yes." She said, "Okay, that's about it." That was having never worked in aerospace before, knowing little to nothing about all the acronyms that they use. Everything is an abbreviation. Knowing nothing about the culture. That was the level of introduction I had to doing a job that would impact everybody that designed the shuttle flight. No pressure.
No pressure again. Just say yes. That's a book. That's a book, isn't it? And how did you navigate the opening, 3 to 6 months of a job that was as important as that, and as you say, maybe obviously you had, you had the skill set, or you wouldn't have been there, but just that kind of going into a job, maybe you didn't have the experience previously. How did you handle it?
I had to learn what I had to learn first. That, and luckily they connected me with the supervisor to kind of answer any questions I had and provide guidance. And he was absolutely phenomenal in guiding me in the right direction of what I needed to know. What I started with was they have a lot of little manuals that they train the astronauts on. They're about a 1/4 inch thick, 5 meters or something like that, 5 millimeters thick, and hundreds of them. I got as many of those as I can, put them in my office, and every day I'd go in and start reading. And after about 3 months of that, I came out and I could at least kind of converse in that language at a minimal level. They had 5 managers that I had to deal with, and each one covered a different phase of the shuttle flight: the launch, ascent, in orbit, orbit, and deorbit and landing. And I had to learn what each of them do, because each of those groups gets information, processes it, and gives it to somebody else. And so I couldn't focus on just one element of that because they interface with each other. In addition to that, the software that they use to design the flights changes about every 6 months. So you have different shuttle flights that are being in work. Each flight takes 2 years of pre-planning before the launch. There's different versions of software that are in effect on any given flight. So there's different little differences there. There's all the aerospace engineers that have their particular focuses. And so what I needed was a big picture of how's this all fit together. So what I did was, my initial task was to flow chart how the work flowed through the organization. And to do that, I took on what I considered the role of a police investigator, to investigate how does this happen. And so I started interviewing all the key people in that operation. I found that each of them would tell me something, and it would fit into one of 3 categories. Either it was the truth and they knew it was the truth, that it was a fudge on the truth because they didn't really want me to know about that piece of the operation. They wanted to kind of keep that within their territory, or they just didn't know, and they were they misunderstood how that piece operated. I'd interview that individual. I'd interview another individual and say, what do you get from him? What do you do with it? Who do you give it to? Interview another one. What do you get from her? What do you do with it? And through that process of interviewing the key subjects, I started seeing what was true, what wasn't true, and started making that map of how things flowed. That probably gave me a better understanding eventually than any of the individuals within the process, because they were focused on their operation and not on everybody else's. And I was looking at the big picture. So within a year, I had a pretty good idea of what the operation was, and then could focus on the individual jobs and what they did within that operation, and then what do they need to know? What are the skill-based competencies that they need to acquire to do that job well, and how do you test and make sure that they have them? It took 3 years to get that in place. After the 3 years, the area that I put it in place with the 90 aerospace engineers, NASA wanted expanded throughout the entire operation. So that was kind of a thumbs up.
Amazing. And what did you enjoy most about those years and that aspect of your career? And maybe could you also tell us what was the most challenging aspect of that particular piece of work that you were doing?
That goes back to kind of never let work get in the way of having fun. How do you define fun? To me, fun is a challenge. It's learning. It's enjoying being with people. It can be a whole variety of things that tap into your motivation. So it could be different for each individual. For me, it was all of those, and as long as I had one piece of that, it didn't matter if somebody over here was being obnoxious and kind of slow down the process. As long as I was having fun over here, I could deal with them and still enjoy the job. And there was so much challenge in learning within that arena. Even the time I spent there, the amount I learned was still minimal to the amount of information that flows within that organization. So it was just for somebody that likes to learn, that has an incurable curiosity about how the world works. It was just a phenomenal plethora of opportunities. And it was actually somewhat hard to keep focused sometimes because there were so many different things that you could learn and the even though it was a tremendous bureaucracy, still you had autonomy within that bureaucracy, and as long as you were I had the support at the highest level. The guy that I was the secretary for, since I was his secretary when I came in, we knew each other on a first name basis, and throughout the entire process had his support. I didn't have his intervention. What he told me was, I said, this would be so much easier if I put together a plan, gave it to you, you said, let's implement it. He said, yeah, but that's not going to work. He said, you put together a plan, you convince these other managers that it's a good plan, have them bring it to me, and I'll approve it. It's actually a much more effective approach. It took longer, it was more stressful, but better results. Because it had the involvement of the people it was going to impact.
Makes sense. And I like what you said there. You said making sure something keeps tapping into your motivation. I really like that. And that's a big topic, just not to go off, or maybe to go off on a tangent just for a minute, but there's an awful lot, in the industry, and you see it on LinkedIn now as well, about burnout and people lacking motivation. And obviously COVID and has lent itself to maybe some of that. Was there ever a period in your, and for someone that's obviously so naturally curious, and obviously the importance of remaining curious and everything, was there a point in your own career where that tapping into the motivation wasn't quite there? And how did you navigate that, if there was such an instance?
A lot of that, my approach on particular jobs for quite a while was that they would max out at about 10 years. Between 8 and 10 years, I would start to lose interest in them because I knew so much. It became routine, and so the challenge wasn't there. And so at that point, then I would start kind of looking elsewhere. Looking back, I find it's useful for people to always be looking elsewhere, because that's when you find the opportunities and such, the windows of opportunity that I mentioned earlier. But for me, about 8 to 10 years in focusing on a particular industry or particular job category was really the extent of where I was able to continue to feed the motivation.
Yeah. But it must have been a very proud moment when NASA took on your work and spread that across the organization.
Yes and no. It was the challenge of putting that program together was so horrendous. The analogy that I use, it's like rolling an elephant up a hill sideways.
Really?
If you slip at any point, that elephant's going to crush you. And so it was a constant, because of kind of the internal politics of the organization, because of the resistance previous to that program, any of those managers could assign their people any job they wanted to. If that individual failed, it was on that individual, not the manager. Subsequent to my program, they couldn't assign people to jobs that they weren't trained for. And if they weren't successful, both parties were responsible, because the managers were in charge of the training and the individuals were responsible for their activities. So the managers knew that that program was going to usurp some of their authority, and they didn't like that. They couldn't say it overtly because the program was supported. It was actually driven by NASA. NASA asked the contractor to put that in place. So they couldn't say, no, we don't want this, because NASA was paying the bills. But functionally, some of them would do little subtle things behind the scenes that made putting that program in place more challenging than it should have been. I had to overcome those challenges, and in that, I learned a lot about human nature, how to confront those challenges. You don't get mad at them. You start asking questions and figure out what's really behind it, and figure out a cooperative approach to solve that issue. But having NASA then do the thumbs up, it was a bittersweet reward of sorts. So it's not like, oh boy, wow, cool. It was like, oh, okay, good.
Yeah, and it's an element of resistance to change then, but obviously huge learning for you as you went through that and trying to educate people on the importance of making it.
And that's I hadn't had any education in the area of change management previous to that. That was really the learning platform for that. But that, in any kind of business, change management, change is what happens most frequently in any type of operation. There's very few operations that can just maintain a given process over a long period of time. It's gonna evolve and change. And so the better you are to manage that change within the organization, the more effectively you can pursue the success of that organization in a safe and productive manner. And I always pair those two things together, because I've written about sustainable profitability. A lot of people just talk about profitability, but if you don't have sustainable on there, just like the explosion in the Gulf, where the oil company blew up and saturated the Gulf with oil, they lost something like $10 to $14 billion almost overnight with that accident. That would put most businesses out of operation. They were big enough that they could handle that hit and still stay in business. But if you don't have safe operations, you can't guarantee the sustainability of profits. So to me, it's important to attach that sustainability element, and that's not sustainability in terms of the environment and those kind of things. It's sustainability in terms of being able to generate profit today, tomorrow, and predictably next week. And so in terms of that, the sustainable profitability, the key factors are you've got to have a safe operation, you've got to have a productive operation, and you've got to serve the customers. You've got to give the customers what you want. If you lose any one of those three elements, the sustainability goes out the window. If you're not safe, you can have an accident tomorrow and you can be out of business or horrendously hurt. If you're not productive, you're not producing, therefore you're going to be out of business soon. If you don't have a customer base that likes what you're doing, you can be productive and safe, but nobody's going to buy it, so you don't have any profits. So you got to have those three foundational elements, and that was really the starting point for understanding that was in looking at how how business operates and the key foundations of that operation that have to be maintained through any kind of change process.
Yeah, makes absolute sense. And so that probably brings us closer to what you're doing today. So when that period I think you stayed right about a decade there. What was the next element of your career? How did you transition into the next piece?
The next piece was I worked 3 different jobs within the space program. I did that one for 3 years. Then I worked on flight software production for about 3 years. Then I worked on astronaut training, desktop simulations for the astronauts for about 3 years. As I got more educated in the business arena and got my skill base built up to a competitive fashion, I learned that you don't get a raise in the aerospace industry unless Congress approves it. And I thought that's a heck of a lobbying process just for me to get a raise. And so I started looking in the energy industry and found some opportunities there and transitioned over to the 4th largest, or actually the largest natural gas pipeline effort at that time.
What were you doing for them?
They wanted they wanted both there was a new regulatory compliance issue that was facing the entire industry. They wanted that taken care of, and then that was expanded to develop an entire technical training program for their complete operation.
Very good. And did you just, is that something you started? Was it more later on, or at what point did that come into it?
Oh, you cut out for a moment on that. What was that?
Yeah, just on the writing side. So you've written, obviously, you're as an author, you've written quite a lot. Was that always? Has that been ongoing throughout all these aspects of your career? Or when did that kick in? That you did. That's
been ongoing since high school, junior high, high school, as an outside effort. During the teaching years, I started writing articles for math publications. During the aerospace years, I didn't do much writing then because that was such a all-consuming effort within there. Then when I moved back to the energy industry, then I had a little bit more time, outside time, and then picked up the writing again with the writing scripts and screenplays and that kind of thing. And then books came along after I worked on screenplays for about 6 or 7 years.
Gotcha. Yeah, you've had such an interesting career, and I have a couple of questions left. I'm going to turn one of the questions you've asked other people in your trucking years back at you. That's the second last question. So what has been one of the most bizarre moments of your lifetime? And that can either be a career moment or something outside of your career. I don't mind.
That is extremely difficult for me to pin down because, as you noticed from our discussion, there's so many unusual situations that I kind of trip over, fall into, are availed of. Let's say the two that stand out to me. One are my wife and I got an invitation to a reception at the White House one time, so that kind of stands out as as kind of unusual. That's not necessarily bizarre. Another one is got the opportunity to drive the USS Topeka, which is a nuclear attack submarine. I got to pilot that off the coast of Florida out in the ocean one time.
How did you manage to get to do that?
I saw an article in the paper. The article, it was a little, about 6-inch article, one column, said the Navy is inviting anybody from Kansas to come and take a trip on the submarine. And I thought, when am I going to get this opportunity other than joining the Navy and spending years and such to train for that? And so we got a friend. We went down to Florida and they piled us on the submarine, and I got to drive it. I got to ride on the conning tower, up on the tower that sticks out of the water while we're cruising through the ocean. Amazing machine, but you have the whole sense while you're on there that somebody's watching you.
Really?
That somebody that doesn't like you is watching you.
Making sure you don't accidentally fall on a button somewhere.
Well, no, somebody outside the submarine. Somebody outside the submarine knows where you are and is keeping track. And but it's just it's things like that, and running into interesting people and having no idea when you bump into them first who they are, what their story is. It's just that I think it's just kind of I have a consistent involvement in bizarre. I'd put it that way instead of one or two items.
Yeah. No, thanks for sharing that. And I guess my last question is, which I kind of ask everybody, if you could have 5 minutes to sit down and have a chat with yourself when you were, let's say, 16 or 17 years old, what would you say to yourself based on all you know now? Or what advice would you give?
I wouldn't give too much different advice, because what happened to that 16-year-old over the years led to where I am today. And I don't know that I compare with other folks I went to high school with. I look at what their careers have happened, and the only difference I really see is that a lot of them focused on a particular area of industry, and of course they accomplished quite a bit in that area. But I think, would I have wanted to do that? That would have gone past that 10-year limit that I had on interest in any particular area, and I wouldn't have driven the truck probably. I wouldn't have done this other thing. I wouldn't have worked the space program. I wouldn't have. It's like, I don't think I would give that 16-year-old any different advice than he gave himself at that time, of just try things, go out and try things, and if they don't work, that's part of learning. Don't be disappointed, or don't look too harshly upon your failures, because you can't succeed unless you fail in most cases. One of the jobs I applied for, when I was applying for jobs after teaching, and what led to ending up in the space program, I had sent out to computer companies and to tech companies what I would say was a stack of letters that measured 1 meter to 1 yard high of rejections that I received. I sent out a ton of letters, and I got a stack of rejections that would measure 1 meter or 1 yard tall. That's a lot of failures if you look at it in terms of failures. But to get the job in the space program, maybe that's the number of tries you have to make to get that one that was a really cool success.
Brilliant. Don't give up.
Persistence, yeah. Focused persistence.
Brilliant. Very great advice. And it's been an honor meeting you. I could keep talking to you, and maybe we'll do another podcast and deep dive into one of the many elements of your career that you've had. And for anybody picking this up on YouTube, we'll obviously have the link to your bio on LinkedIn, and also the link to the books that you've authored as well, for people that might be interested in picking those up.
Maybe just mention the recent book is Don't Run Naked Through the Office, which that's probably the advice I would give to the 16-year-old or the previous me, or anybody in an office or business type setting, is organized guidance on how to become self-managed in your career, how to take on those career elements, the things that are really important in achieving success. How do you manage those yourself? Not leave it to the company, not leave it to somebody else to do that for you. but you adopt that, and that's Don't Run Naked Through the Office, that book on Amazon.
Fantastic. And on that note, Fred, thank you very much, and thank you, everybody. Fred, you can hold on. I'll just stop the recording.
Okay,
Thanks,
my
everybody.
pleasure.
Bye-bye.